August 30th, Tokyo Bay lay silent beneath a pale morning haze. The war that had consumed the world for 6 long years was over. Japan, once a proud empire, now stood broken. Cities had been flattened into ash. Rice fields left barren, and millions of civilians were starving. In the ruins of that empire, something extraordinary was about to unfold. A story not of vengeance, but of mercy. For months, Japanese civilians had been taught to fear the Americans. Propaganda warned that U.S. soldiers were monsters, men who would slaughter the old, enslave the women, and burn what little remained. Mothers whispered these warnings to their children as they huddled in shelters. During air raids, many believed it completely. So when word spread that the American occupation forces were arriving, entire villages braced for the worst. Some even prepared to take their own lives rather than face capture. But when the American ships appeared off the coast of Japan, the reality was nothing like the nightmare they had been told. On those ships were not conquerors, but young men, many barely out of their teens, exhausted from years of war and desperate for peace. They looked upon Japan not with hatred, but pity. In Yokohama, the first waves of U.S. soldiers stepped onto Japanese soil. The silence was haunting. Streets were empty, shops abandoned, homes half destroyed. Through shattered windows, the soldiers could see frightened faces peeking from behind paper doors. One sergeant from the 8th Army later wrote, "We expected ambushes, but we found hunger instead." Children were the first to emerge, small, skeletal figures in tattered clothes, barefoot on the dusty roads. Their eyes were hollow, their bellies swollen from malnutrition. Some carried scraps of cloth tied like satchels. Others clutched the hands of their mothers. The Americans froze, rifles ready, unsure what to do. But then, one soldier reached into his rucksack and pulled out a can of Spam. He opened it with his knife and held it out to the nearest child. The boy hesitated, trembling, then stepped forward. He took the can, sniffed it cautiously, and began to eat. The soldiers watched as he smiled, a tiny, fragile smile that would be remembered for a lifetime. That moment broke the invisible wall between enemy and human. Word spread quickly through the neighborhoods. The Americans are giving us food. Within days, crowds began forming near checkpoints and depots. The same hands that once held weapons now passed out rations, canned meat, chocolate bars, biscuits, powdered milk. The U.S. Army had planned to feed the Japanese population to prevent mass starvation. Operation Blacklist, as the occupation was called, had as its first mission to sustain life and restore order. In Tokyo, General Douglas MacArthur established his headquarters at the Daiichi building. From his office window, he could see lines of civilians stretching for blocks outside U.S. food distribution points. He saw deeply moved him. These were not enemies anymore. They were victims of their own militarist government, abandoned and desperate. MacArthur ordered the immediate expansion of food shipments. Tons of rice, flour, and medical supplies began arriving from the Philippines, Hawaii, and the continental United States. The Japanese could hardly believe what they were seeing. For years, they had been told Americans would destroy them. Yet here were soldiers carrying bags of rice into villages, helping farmers rebuild irrigation ditches, and teaching children how to purify water. One elderly woman in Yokosuka recalled later, "They treated us like people. I could not understand it. We had hated them so much." In small towns across Honshu and Kyushu, this pattern repeated itself. The Americans, trained to fight and kill, were now distributing bread and medicine. They repaired bridges, cleared rubble, and reopened schools. In the evenings, children would gather near the military camps, waiting for leftovers from the mess hall. Many soldiers secretly saved portions of their meals, slipping them to the waiting kids through the wire fences. One soldier wrote home, "We fought them for years. Now, I can't stand to see them hungry." Perhaps the most striking transformations happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, cities annihilated by atomic fire only weeks earlier. When American relief teams arrived, they expected hostility, perhaps even revenge. Instead, They found silence and suffering beyond words. Thousands of burn victims lined the streets, hospitals overflowing with the wounded. The medics worked day and night, tending to people who just weeks earlier had been the enemy. The Japanese doctors and nurses were stunned. Many had never seen an American face up close. Now, they were working side by side to save lives. One Hiroshima nurse later said, "I thought they would kill us." Instead, they brought bandages. American soldiers distributed penicillin, disinfectants, and blankets. They gave clean water to patients dying of radiation sickness. Some held the hands of the dying, whispering words they didn't even share a language for. The moment was beyond politics. It was simply human. Meanwhile, in rural Japan, the struggle for survival continued. Entire villages lived on meager rations, grass soup, potato peels, anything they could find. When U.S. trucks arrived, carrying sacks of grain and powdered milk, people wept openly. They bowed deeply to the soldiers, some dropping to their knees in gratitude. A corporal from Kansas described the scene. "They bowed to us like we were gods. But I felt ashamed. I didn't want worship. I wanted them to eat." American officers worked closely with local leaders to organize fair food distribution. Japanese police and even former Imperial Army officers cooperated under strict orders from MacArthur's headquarters. Within weeks, malnutrition rates began to drop. Children gained weight. Disease outbreaks slowed. The shock of mercy began to replace the fear of occupation. It wasn't just food that changed lives. Clothing drives from the U.S. sent tons of used garments, blankets, and shoes. The Red Cross distributed them across the islands. Japanese women who once sewed military uniforms now stitched together, donated American cloth to make dresses for their children. For many, it was the first time in years they felt human again. And yet, it wasn't an easy peace. There were still scars, burned cities, lost families, the unbearable memory of war. Many Japanese men returned home from battlefields in China or the Pacific only to find their homes gone. But even then, American soldiers helped them rebuild. One photograph taken in 1946 shows a US corporal helping a Japanese carpenter raise the first wall of a new house on the outskirts of Tokyo. The carpenter's young daughter stands beside them, holding a hammer far too big for her hands. The compassion of those soldiers changed everything. It softened the anger, broke the propaganda, and began something neither side expected: trust. Within 2 years, Japan's economy started to recover under American supervision. Schools reopened, markets returned, trains ran again. The same people who once hid from the Americans now waved at them on the streets. Children learned English phrases like hello and thank you. And every time they said it, a soldier smiled back and handed them another piece of chocolate. For the U.S. troops, the experience changed them as well. Many returned home with new respect for the Japanese people. They had seen the human cost of total war and how kindness could heal where bullets once destroyed. In letters home, soldiers wrote, not about victory, but about compassion. One wrote to his mother, "We fed the enemy today, and I think it made me a better man." In 1947, a Japanese school in Yokohama erected a small plaque dedicated to the American soldiers who fed the hungry. It read, "To those who brought not only peace, but bread." The story became known among veterans as the quiet miracle of Japan. And perhaps it was in a world broken by hatred. The simplest acts, a can of Spam, a chocolate bar, a shared meal, did more to rebuild a nation than any treaty or weapon ever could. By the time the occupation ended in 1952, Japan was a different country. The children who once waited for scraps outside the American camps were now students in rebuilt schools. Many of them would grow up to lead the Japan that emerged as one of the world's most peaceful, prosperous nations. When historians later asked General MacArthur what he believed was the key to Japan's recovery, he answered simply, "We treated them as humans, not as enemies." From the ashes of Hiroshima to the starving villages of Kyushu, that truth echoed. Mercy had replaced fear. The American soldiers who gave their food to Japanese civilians didn't just feed a nation, they fed its soul. In doing so, they rewrote the ending of a war that had once seemed incapable of mercy. For the Japanese civilians, who had been told the Americans were monsters, the soldiers who arrived to occupy Japan came not with cruelty, but compassion. Their generosity became the first act of peace in a world that had forgotten what peace looked like. An old woman still remembers the taste of that first can of Spam, the one a nervous American soldier handed her when, she said later, it tasted like hope.